So 1993 was the year that the whole Power Rangers craze came coming, and with the big fat comes along the unavoidable wave of spin-offs and also rants and copycats and whatnots. One of these spin-offs was a little series called VR Troopers, a Saban-helmed show featuring three common folks acquiring powers and abilities to take on the forces of the evil Grimlord, a villainous overlord who aims to break through the barrier between our world and the world of virtual reality in hopes of taking over both, or something to that extent. The show was apparently somewhat popular enough to last a good 2 seasons before ending abruptly due to the lack of Japanese footage to toss in, and was apparently popular enough to merit a video game adaptation, and that's what we're going to be looking at today, VR Troopers for the Sega Genesis. There's also a Game Gear version on the market, but I know nothing of that, so we're not going to touch that. As you can tell from the footage before you, VR Troopers is a fairly basic one-on-one fighting game, much akin to all the other basic one-on-one fighting games that were available on the market at the time. You have 3 modes of play in this game. The story mode, where the main story of VR Troopers takes place. Versus mode, where you and a second player can beat the crap out of each other using the game's 8 characters. And CPU Duel, which is the same as Versus mode, except against the computer instead of another human opponent. Obviously, the main meat of the game resides in the story mode, where you pick one of 3 VR Troopers to face off against Grimlord's band of monsters, Trooper Twins, and a final boss whose powers are reminiscent of a final boss from another fighting game franchise that's slightly more popular. Each fight is a best of 3 rounds contest, or whatever rounds you have picked in the options, and the object of the game is to beat your opponent into submission. Fairly obvious, right? Now, in between the one-on-one fights, you have these additional rounds where you have to fend off against Skugs, the Grimlord's foot soldiers, or more appropriately, the putty patrollers of the VR Trooper universe. The general idea is to knock 2 Skugs together in order to defeat them, and continue this holding pattern of limitless Skug waves until time expires. Outlast the timer and you will move on to the next match, but fail here and you have to refight the previously defeated monster of the day. Now, I'm going to say that the concept of the battle grid rounds is not a bad one. It makes for a nice addition to the story mode that mixes it up a bit, so that it isn't just a straight-on one-on-one fighter in the traditional sense. In a way, it reminds me of the Power Ranger games on the Game Gear, where you'd fight several putties before taking on the main monster, except in reverse, and done more poorly. Because the idea is to outlast the endless waves of Skusks before time expires, each subsequent battle grid round adds more time to the clock, so you have to endure the Skug waves for a longer period than the previous round. The problem is that these rounds are downright tedious affairs, and it's almost a chore to sloth through all these Skugs before time expires. On top of that, your special moves are disabled during these encounters, and it is very easy for the Skug pair to corner you and basically beat you to submission, thus forcing you to resort to cheap tactics and endless button mashing to survive. Not fun. Meh. That's all I gotta say in that regard. Could have been a good idea, but the execution's kinda crap. Sorry. Each of the game's 8 fighters, 3 VR Troopers, and 5 virtual monsters, have a basic set of punches and kicks along with 3 special moves. The special moves themselves are surprisingly simplistic to pull off, mostly involving pushing the directional pad in a certain direction in conjunction with a punch or kick button. In fact, the most complex button command in VR Troopers is the few charge moves in the game, like how you would do a Sonic Boom in Street Fighter. So anyone looking for deep fighting game mechanics need not check in here, because obviously you're not going to get them here. As such, VR Troopers is one of the few fighting games on the Sega Genesis that can be played with the original 3-button controller just fine. That having been said, there is support for the 6-button controller, but only if you're playing on the Kids or Easy mode, where the X, Y, and Z buttons are used as shortcut keys for your fighter's special moves, and as such can easily be spammed to your heart's content. Any difficulty setting beyond those 2 disables said shortcut keys. And again, the moves themselves involve very simplistic combinations, and theoretically could be performed rather easily as a result, although I found response time is somewhat of an issue at times. Not always, but more often than not, a move will not execute despite the simple commands, but whatever. Not a big deal. Presentation-wise, graphics in VR Troopers are actually pretty good. Not just for a licensed kids game, but actually good enough to be a average run-of-the-mill Genesis title. The character models themselves are nothing amazing, just these really small characters with little detail to them. But they move about rather smoothly and they're not jerky or anything in animation, and at the very least they're fairly varied in appearance, even if the monsters are rather uninspired. The various arenas, though, look very nice, lots of detail to the background and foreground, nice scrolling effects, nice use of the colors to give it some atmosphere, really nice work with the backgrounds, I gotta say. Now the story mode also has a couple cutscenes, mostly intermissions featuring the mentor offering advice and the Grimlord taunting you. They look alright, that's all I gotta say. Though the dog looks like crap. And yes, this dog could talk, that much about the show this thing's based on, I know well enough. Sound in VR Troopers is a mixed bag here. There's some brief snippets of voice fights to be found here, your typical grainy, scratchy hi-yas and ooh-yas you get in a lot of stuff like this. Sound effects are rather meh, they're just there. As far as the music goes, it's alright. There's nothing memorable about it. There might be at least one or two standout tunes, but on a whole, it's a rather black collection of tunes that, at the very least, they're tunes and not auditory nightmares. My only real regret is that my unfamiliarity with the VR Troopers show means I don't know if any of the tunes are from the show itself. Anyone who's watched the show and played the game will probably know better in this regard than I would. To me, the tunes are just... They're alright, but nothing special. When I first picked this game up a few years back, I was actually kind of curious, but at the same time I was expecting another bare-bones and shallow fighting kin, much akin to that initial Power Rangers release on the Genesis a year prior. But VR Troopers actually surprised me by offering me a somewhat decent, albeit simple, fighting game. You have a rather sizable roster of characters to play with for the time, a well-structured story mode, and the overall package looks pretty damn slick. Don't kid yourself though, this is not the best fighting game on the Sega Genesis, nor is it close to being the deepest one. At best, VR Troopers could be considered a beginner's fighting game for the kids who want to get into the genre and find Street Fighter 2 to be a bit complex for their tastes. At worst, it's a mild curiosity piece worth a couple bucks and an hour's worth of gameplay at most. But at the very least, and for whatever it's worth, the VR Troopers have a better fighting game on the Sega Genesis than the Power Rangers do, so that's one point in its favor. And that's all I got. Goodbye.